When I saw the painting, Augusta, the winged man, and Rasha, the black dove, and I saw it in an exhibition in Berlin in the 80s. I was standing in front of a painting that had been painted so many years before that by a man who couldn't certainly have known me, but I felt that he was painting my predicament, because he rightly put together this man who was quote unquote deformed, and so someone who people would stare at because he was a quote freak of nature. He paired him with a completely normal woman, except that she was black. I grew up in a town which, Akron, Ohio, at that time was about 250,000, 300,000 people. So it was not a small town. It was an industrial town, and though it wasn't New York City, it had the feeling of a city about it.
In the newer, greater Akron, all new living today. WCW.
So my first real experiences with small towns really happened in Germany, going through villages. When I realized that there was a type of geography where people still lived in the village that their ancestors lived in from the 16th century or earlier. Though that village might be incorporated in a larger town, it still kept its villageness, I guess we could call it, with the notion that you had to keep up your yard for your neighbor, and the way they were nestled into the hills. You could see why they sprouted up, because there was water flowing through the valley. That made a real impression on me, because where I grew up, the geography was not as important anymore. And I grew up without really understanding why my town happened to nestle right between these two river valleys for water power, for instance, for the industries. That connectedness to the land was something that I experienced actually as an outsider, looking at these small towns. And I think that's always made an impression on me since, because I need to feel why I'm standing right where we are, or at that moment. I need to feel why or how I fit on the earth. the geography of small towns, it really evinced to me a real fascination with Akron, Ohio, my hometown, and how it became what it became, the rubber capital of the world. How did industry come to all of those towns along the Great Lakes? How that the rivers and the Great Lakes, how that fed into that. And it was probably the seeds for my book, Thomas and Beulah, though I didn't know it at that time. I began to look back and say, oh, that's where you come from. That's the earth you come from. Why? How did you become who you are through that?
The Zeppelin Factory needed workers, all right. But standing in the cage of the whale's belly, sparks flying off the joints and noise thundering, Thomas wanted to sit right down and cry. That spring, the third largest airship was dubbed the biggest joke in town, though they all turned out for the launch. Wind caught. The Akron floated out of control. 3 men in tow. One dropped to safety, one hung on, but the third must.
Thomas comes north in search of the American dream. And at that time, the early 20s, in Akron, Ohio, the American dream was in full production. And in the poem, The Zeppelin Factory, it's a point where Thomas both confronts his own guilt of surviving with a kind of disruption of the American dream, or kind of an industrialization gone wild, because in that poem, there he is in a factory. This is not the American dream, to sit there on a kind of to be working in that kind of assembly line.
Thomas at night in the vacant lot. Here I am, intact and faint-hearted. Thomas hiding his heart with his hat at the football game, eyeing the Goodyear blimp overhead. Big boy, I know you're in there.
Every Zeppelin that he sees reminds him of being someone who has managed to float away from the morass. He is like Jonah in the belly of the whale, and he's also like Noah in the ark. He's both of them. He's the one who gets away, but he carries with him all the guilt of those who didn't make it. His friend who dies in the Mississippi, but also every person who didn't make it to the Great Migration, who didn't survive. And then comes this great Zeppelin disaster, because everyone thought at that time Zeppelins were that was the transportation of the future, until several things happened. And then there was the Zeppelin called the Akron, ironically enough, where men who were holding it down as they were, it was trying to take off. They were trying to get it situated so that the winds would hit it just right, and it takes off with the men in tow. And one of them, and there's footage, incredible footage of this, where this man is hanging onto that mooring, and then he drops, and he just falls and falls and falls to his death, which is it's a nightmare. Yes, it is a nightmare. It's an American nightmare as well. So Thomas then is confronted with the idea that he survives. He's intact. His friend Lem didn't survive. He drowns in the river. This man holding on to that American dream in the form of a Zeppelin couldn't hang on and dropped. So he's becoming aware of the fact that this dream may not be as easily attainable as he had hoped.
You came with a cello in one hand, in the other, nothing. Play, you said. I played the scales of ignorant evenings. I played in high heels to be closer to you. When you snapped off a stem from the vase, you broke my little finger. This is a theme in Moth. It begins with the children's blind bodies. It ends with the boys in the orchestra. Tell me that you did not profit from me, you with the pewter hands.
My relationship with the cello is a long one, and it almost feels like the cello was there from the beginning. Of course, it wasn't. I started playing cello when I was 10 years old. I had really very little knowledge about which instrument to play. I just wanted to do a string instrument because my brother did the winds, so, I didn't want to be following in his footsteps. We had a healthy competition. Cello sounded luscious. It just sounded like something you could just eat. So I said, a cello. Had no idea what a cello was. And when I saw this humongous thing, it wasn't as big as a bass, but it was big enough. For a minute, my heart kind of went like that. And then I thought, no, this is what you chose. This is what you take. And I grew to love it. I dragged it home to practice. You can wrap yourself around a cello. I've always felt that I was enveloping the sound. And if I treated her right, and it's always been a her to me, if I treated her right, she would sing. Actually had to decide for myself whether I was going to be a musician or a poet. And that was about in the middle of my college career, because I was playing in the orchestra, taking lessons. I loved music. I loved the fact that this individual outpouring kind of flowed in with the whole sound, and being a sound that was just bigger than you. I loved that about orchestras. I loved the intricate call and response and conversation that happened in chamber music. Every time I tried to play or do performances, I would get so nervous and my knee would shake, which is not something you can have happen if you're going to be a cellist. And it was that stage fright that made me decide that I needed to, that music would always be with me and it would be a vocation, but it wasn't going to be my true profession. And I loved writing just as much. Those loves were equal. I would even say they're still equal.
Sawdust kicks up, swirls around his boots, and settles in the cuffs of his pants. The saw is as nervous as a parrot. The chair shrinks. After years of cupboards and end tables, after a plywood Santa and 7 elves for the lawn and snow, he knows he's failed, and in oak. Next Christmas, he buys himself and his son a telescope.
My father was an amateur astronomer, and I can't remember when we didn't have a telescope, some kind of telescope in the house. And he would take this telescope out and show us Mars and Jupiter and Venus. Two things were happening. I must have been about 10 or 11, my first memory of this. But the other thing that was happening is that my father is a very distant man, actually. Loving, but distant. And as a child, you wonder, you don't see the loving as much as the distance because but he could be very quiet, he could go quiet.
Contrary to tales you told us summer nights when the air conditioner broke, the stars are not far apart. Rather, they draw closer together with years, and houses shrivel, unlost, and porches sag. Neighbors phone to report cracks in the cellar floor, roots of the willow coming up. Stars speak to a child. The past is silent. Just between me and you, woman to man, outer space is inconceivably intimate.
And yet these moments, which required quiet, were very intimate. When he showed us the stars, something so far away, I felt closer to him than I had ever felt. So there was a telescoping of distance. And then when I wrote poems about my father and his telescope, my father's telescope and Anti-Father, or Father Out Walking on the Lawn, which are all about my relationship to my father, time enters in because when I wrote those poems now, I was an adult. I was older. I could look back on this time that I didn't quite understand as a child, but paid attention to very, like children can only do. You watch that moment very carefully. So I could remember it very clearly. And when I did that, I realized that time also was telescoping, that I was simultaneously the child and the adult. And I understood how this was one way for him to speak to us, to be close to us. So the intimacy that I felt as a child was really there. But now I understood why. So this telescoping of both the distance up and the distance to my father, as well as time, it all becomes rather Einsteinian, I guess. I did go to church when I was young. It was part of, it was a given. I'm an atheist now, but I also think of that time in the church as this was really being brought into the, people talk about being brought into the bosom of the church. That's how you feel, like you're being brought to this bosom. Incredible warmth and real sense of community, which was also tied up not only with the religion, but with the music, which was absolutely essential. I went went to church every Sunday. I was a junior usher, which meant standing in the aisles and leading people to their seats. I wanted to be in the choir, but only the fast girls were in the choir, and parents wouldn't let me be in the choir. I also remember being in church every time. I waited for the hymns, because they said, turn to page so-and-so in your hymnal, and ready to go. I was ready to go and to just join that swell of people. And in fact, my father and I used to, we would sit there, stand there and sing and make up harmonies and play around with the notes. And he loved to do that too. So that's one of the memories I have of church is standing up there and singing with my father in that kind of playful way, because he understood music that way too. He would improvise off of the chords. And my mother looking over at us like, oh my gosh, there they go again. But no, that was part of it. I do believe we shall overcome someday. You know what I love about that too? I love the fact that the words, we shall overcome, they seem to say power and triumph. And the tune has this calmness to it, and a resignation, like, we're working on this, we're not going to give up on this, but everything's not going to happen right at this moment. And indeed, after the March on Washington, you had the assassination of Kennedy, and then later, So there will be setbacks, but we will keep going. Perseverance.
1963. That winter, I stopped loving the president and loved his dying. He smiled from his frame on the shiffer robe and watched as I reined in each day using buttons for rosary beads. Oh, 1963. That was a year for the country, for me, really, because 1963, I was 11. My period had started. I was just beginning to contemplate the fact that I was moving into another phase of my life. But it was also the year that the March on Washington happened. Our family went down on my birthday, my 11th birthday, for my father to march in the March on Washington on August 28th. So in an interesting way, the very personal, this 11th birthday, and I always thought the 11th birthday was magic, 2 ones, it's like 2 legs marching off into the future. That coincided with a very, very big thing that was happening in the world that I didn't quite understand, except I knew that it was very important, that it was frightening, and we didn't know that what the future would bring because of that. And that, happened. The bombing in Birmingham happened with the 4 girls getting killed in the church. A few weeks after that, it was a time of incredible turmoil. At the same time, I felt that my childhood was over. Then tap water rinsed orange through my underwear. You moved away, and in tall white buildings typed speeches, each word cluster a satellite, a stone cherry that arced over the violent bay, broadcasting ball games and goodwill to Cuba. But to me, stretched out under percal, the cherry blinks sadly, goodbye, goodbye, spinning into space. In this black place, I touch the doorknobs of my knees, begging to open me. An erector set, spilled and unpuzzled. I got a notice a telegram actually, that was delivered to my home, that I had been chosen as a presidential scholar, and it was signed by President Nixon. And I thought this was a joke. No, come on. So in one fell swoop, I not only had to take my first plane trip, but I also took my first trip alone. I was absolutely terrified. I was so terrified that I was sick, and then I got over being sick. And then I got on the plane where I got sick again. But, it was really one step at a time. Absolutely terrified. Now, there was the question of meeting Nixon. And he was not my favorite president, let's put it that way. And in the end, we ended up not shaking hands with President Nixon because the presidential scholars had put together a petition protesting the war. And he got wind of it. And so, in fact, it was Halderman who presented things. He also came to our hotel and gave us a very stern lecture about violating the cordiality they were showing us by preparing this petition. How they found out about the petition, we don't know, but there are a lot of things that happen like that, aren't there? That was my first lesson in that as well. So though we did meet Nixon, he did not present the medal to us. He was afraid someone was going to give him the petition personally. But there we were so innocent and thinking we're going to make this petition, it's going to be great, and not realizing that you have to be very careful when you do those things. So that was a lesson as well. And it was almost a boy who undid the double sadness I'd sealed away. He built a house in a meadow no one stopped to admire, and wore wrong clothes. Nothing seemed to get in his way. I promised him anything if he would go. He smiled and left. How to recreate his motives, irretrievable as a gasp? Where else to find him, counter-rising in me, almost a boy?
There were all sorts of things. I think as an African American, one would have to be blind and deaf at that time in this nation's history not to feel that the world was part of your personal life. In 1968, at that point in my life, I think I began to realize that my very personal existence was also tied up with a social consciousness, we could say, or a world that I lived in and had to negotiate. I remember feeling kind of ripped out of my studentdom, my being a pupil and having a day go in its accustomed trot to having the world just blast in on me. Oh, deep in my heart, it was a reminder that it's always there. And that awareness marked in a way the ending of childhood. Overcome someday.
In the stucco house, there is nothing but air. The Mexican sky shivers toward morning. I am on the 4-star vacation from the wings of man to these halls draped in heavy matting where lizards hang from light fixtures. From an invisible courtyard comes the broken applause of castanets. Romance may lurk in the land of white orchids, but no slim-hipped Latin comes for me. Coated servants scuttle through the halls. I hear the morning wind around the house as the light goes out to the shanties in the mountains. I went with my family. My father piled the 4 children and his wife and took along another cousin who was my parents' age. His family as well. So there were 4 children in each car, and a married couple in each car, 6 people per car. We drove down to Mexico from Akron, Ohio. And on the way, we stopped at distant relatives who lived in Georgia. My father was born in Georgia. And also in Florida. There were some who lived in Florida. And this was my first experience with the deep song. That's where I first ran into my first segregated beach. And these cousins of mine laughingly told us, this is the line, this part of the beach is ours, and that's theirs. And it was deserted, but so they amused themselves by running across the line all the time and laughing. And I was terrified. I thought, oh my God, you don't do that. And suddenly we were in Mexico. And in Mexico, everything changed. The attitude of the people that we met toward us. Here, you had 2 carloads of Black people driving through, and the lack of, what could you say? The lack of, there was no self-consciousness. People were very friendly, were welcoming, almost welcoming as if to say, you are one of us. And it was the first time, I think, in my entire life, I felt like I wasn't beleaguered. I hadn't realized that I was beleaguered until that moment when there was this freedom of exchange and just acceptance of who we were for what we were. People, isn't that great? And it was phenomenal. I can't even explain it, really. The time in Mexico was eye-opening for that. Everywhere we went, there was a feeling of people being welcoming. And their curiosity was born of, it was a curiosity about where we came from, America, United States of America, Ohio, which was so far north that they really had never met anyone there. They were more curious about our license plate than they were about the color of our skin. And in Mexico, there were many events that were pretty amazing, but 2 of them that really stick out for me, besides meeting my pen pal and his family. Well, one of them was discovering Diego Rivera, whose work I really didn't know before that. But that coming in contact with this enormous, forceful personality, which still it just pours out of the work. Those incredible murals, which were not only larger than life, they were almost larger than the world. They just assumed that the world was his platform. And that kind of fearlessness and openness and connection to a larger humanity was something that I really had not come in contact with. I mean, I think that the sense of community, the sense of Black community in the United States was something, of course, I was very familiar with, but that, again, was a beleaguered community. And there was something about Rivera's work which blasted through that beleagueredness and just said, just said, we are all peoples of the world. Years later, when I wrote the poem Parsley, for instance, I never felt that I was being a cultural tourist in that world, that I understood how hate and fear of difference and power based on things which were not based on race or skin or color or cultural identity, that these are things I was really familiar with. This was part of my world. El General has found his word, perrajil. Who says it lives. He laughs, teeth shining out of the swamp. The cane appears in our dreams, lashed by wind and streaming. And we lie down. For every drop of blood, there is a parrot imitating spring. Out of the swamp, the cane appears. I left Akron, which was something that many of my relatives did not do. They did not leave northeastern Ohio, but I left. I went to Germany, first of all. That was unheard of, to go away for a year. And then once I left, I really never came back. And I was going places that I think to my family were places they couldn't imagine a Black person would ever live. One of the amazing things about being sent abroad, I was on a Fulbright to Germany, was that I began to experience Germans as human beings, as individual people. The Germany that I knew at that time was the Germany of, either the Germany of monsters, this is of World War II and concentration camps, or the Germany of the great masters. I loved the literature. I wanted to study the Germany of Hölderlin and Heine and Goethe, with whom I shared a birthday. So I always, felt this kinship with Goethe, just for that little fact. But those are two very different views, and both of them were in a certain way cartoon images of what Germany was. Coming to Tübingen, meeting people, professors who, in fact, one of my most influential professors was a man by the name of Hoffman, Dr. Paul Hoffman, and he was Jewish. He had spent the war in New Zealand tending sheep and came back to Germany because he loved to teach the poetry of Stefan Georg. And I spent many an afternoon in his office as he told me how he tended sheep and how you recognized, the young and all of that, and also taught me a lot about the love of this literature. And for him, that triumphed all of the evil,
he wanted to go back to that. So there was one individual, and then yet there were my friends that I knew, and then there were negative experiences as well. But I also realized that there was an incredible load of guilt that every German felt they had to work through, whether they had lived at the time of World War II or not. And so that reflexive kind of defiance was almost part of the makeup of young Germans at that time. So let's find another victim, because let's find another person to point the fingers at so people will stop pointing them at us. First of all, I was amazed as a naive young Black American that there was such a high anti-American sentiment there. I was amazed, not that there wasn't anti-American sentiment, but that I wasn't included in that anti-American sentiment, because as a Black American woman, many of the young Germans that I met assumed, of course, that I was on the side of the right, and that I knew what it was like to be oppressed by my government, and therefore they weren't going to include me in the accusations. They were actually right. I mean, I did feel from a very young age that there was one law for most of America, and then there was a law that could perhaps be applied to my race, so that I needed to tread carefully and, all of that. But stepping into Germany in 1974 was an almost schizophrenic feeling, because on the one hand, I was an American. Yes, I was against the war, but also I also felt that the Germans were perhaps the last people to be pointing fingers. So it was actually pretty fascinating. One day, I remember I stopped in front of this huge hedge that I used to walk by every day on my way to class. And I didn't know what was behind the hedge, but I could hear all of these birds, and they seemed to love this one particular garden. It was in an area where there were a lot of old people, and I would see, because German women always go out and sweep their steps in the morning. You have to keep you're responsible to keep your particular piece of sidewalk clean. And so they would go out and clean their front stoops and wipe them off. So I would see these women in their kittel, in their aprons, come out and do their steps. And some of them would say, Guten Tag. And I was always surprised that you would say Guten Tag to me. And, some didn't, but it always, I caught myself in that surprise. They're human beings. Why wouldn't they say, why are you assuming that they hate you? Try to imagine who lived behind that hedge, who loved birdsong so much that they obviously had flowers and feeders so that they would come. That started a poem called The Birdfrau.
When the boys came home, everything stopped the way he left it. Her apron, the back stairs, the sun losing altitude over France as the birds scared up from the fields, a whirring curtain of flak. Barmherzigkeit, her son, her man. She went inside, fed the parakeet, broke its neck. Spätzle bubbling on the stove, wind chimes tinkling above the steam, her face in the hall mirror, bloated, a heart. Let everything go wild. Blue jays, crows. She hung suet from branches, the air quick around her head with tiny spastic machinery, starlings, finches, her head a crown of feathers. She ate less, grew lighter, air tunneling through bone, singing a small song. Ein Liedchen, Kinder. The children ran away. She moved about the yard like an old rag bird. Still at war, she rose at dawn, watching out for Rudy, come home on crutches, the thin legs balancing his atom of life.
In order to come to your house or to find your house, we followed the precise instructions you forwarded us via email. The 4 paragraphs were preceded by the title, Directions to Rita Dove's House. Question: would I get directions to return to the outside world, or do I have to figure that one out on my own?
Directions to Rita Dove's house. I give the directions to my house, but you're going to have to find your way out again by yourself. I think, it's really interesting because people don't do that. I don't do that either. You follow directions somewhere and then you turn around and go, how do I get back? Maybe you don't get back. Maybe you're changed and you just find a different way out.
At the end of the day, Rita, is the port worth the cruise?
At the end of the day, is the port worth the cruise? The cruise is worth the cruise.